What's up? Today, I want to talk to you guys about a book that I read last year. I've got this giant stack of books over here that half of them I've already read and I'm working through them. That's why they're next to my bed. And I really want to start sharing those ideas with you guys. So the one I want to talk to you guys about today is Against the Web, and it is by the late Michael Brooks. He was a commentator on the Michael Brooks show and the Majority Report, as well as some others. And it's a really good book. It's a short read. I read it in the middle of last year, and it focuses on critiquing the arguments of the intellectual dark web. If you're not familiar with that terminology, it was given by Barry Weiss of the New York Times, and it is about people that, specific examples are Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, Dave Rubin, Brett and Eric Weinstein, Sam Harris, basically people that were considered intellectual renegades by Barry Weiss. And this all stems from a New York Times article. So look that up if you want more information. But essentially, Michael saw that these people had a lot of influence online because they were very popular on YouTube, especially the last several years. And they have a big influence, though, on the political discourse in the U.S., especially. And he wanted to try and critique the arguments of them. And Michael's a really engaging writer. He simplifies complicated global political topics in like a very approachable way. And, and he does this all with his normal, excellent wit. He's he's a very funny guy. And I'll you check out the videos of him talking about these guys, and you'll see what I'm talking about. But in the book, he talks about some specific examples where he'll have the chapter names as a little cheeky, and so one of them is called "The History is Completely Irrelevant," and this is about Sam Harris. If you don't know, Sam Harris was a new atheist pundit. So essentially, back in early 2010s, around the time right after Christopher Hitchens died, there was a rise in the online skeptic and atheist community. Sam Harris was one of those, the most notable probably, and he was known for having a outrageous discussion with on Bill Maher's show with Ben Affleck about radical Islam, as he would coin it. And what Michael focuses on in this book is the critiquing his arguments, Sam's arguments about moral objectivity being able to be arrived at through reason, right? And then he also talks about how Sam Harris will use these different arguments to talk about other nations or societies or cultures in a patronizing and paternalistic way. And so, as an example, he talks about how, Sam Harris will suggest that, in quotes, not all societies have the same degree of moral wealth, right? And he argues that, this type of moral wealth, and then again in quotes, leads to the result of political and economic stability, literacy, and a modicum of economic equality. And what's really important to understand here, and what I really like that Michael does, is when each of these examples that he gives, he talks about the arguments that they're making, and he talks about historical and philosophical context of those arguments. For example, he compares this to the argument of white man's burden. White man's burden was an idea in the late 1800s that was essentially a justification of the imperialism of Africa and the Philippines by the U.S., suggesting that there was a moralistic argument that white people and white nations owed it morally. They had a moral, burden to civilize these backwards people. And that, yes, it is extremely racist. Like that is, it's not, no two bouts about it. And he uses the book On Liberty, written by John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill is a, generally very often cited political philosopher on the right libertarian side, and he talks about using a quote from On Liberty, and I'll read that now. Is I hardly need to say that this is doctrine is meant to apply only to human beings when they have reached the age of maturity. We aren't speaking of children or of young persons below the age of the law fixes as that of manhood or womanhood. Those who still need to be taken care of by others must be protected against their own actions as well as against external injury. For the same reason, we may leave out of consideration those backward states of society in which the race itself may be considered as not yet adult. And that's extremely messed up, obviously. But this is essentially the same argument. This is where he was making a classical defense of human freedom, and he was arguing it, though, from the perspective of that human freedom was being bestowed upon these, as he would put it, these backward people by the ones with more moral wealth. And so again, I think it's really important in the way that Michael talks about this is he's contextualizing in a way where I, as someone who was really interested in, African history and took, advanced placement European history in high school, I learned about a lot of this. And so I already had the perspective. So when I heard people like Sam Harris say this, I was like, this is pretty old stuff that's just being re-argued, but from a position where it's kind of not sounding as overtly racist as it was originally. But a lot of people didn't get that, and that's why, again, looking at things from a historical perspective is very important when we're talking about philosophy, politics, anthropology. It's really important. And I think that's a really good thing that he points out in the Sam Harris chapter. Then he has the longest chapter of the book is called The Dragon Who Didn't Do His Homework, and it's about Jordan Peterson. If you're aware of Jordan Peterson, he is, he wrote the book 12 Rules for Life. His other main work is called Maps of Meaning. And basically 12 Rules for Life is a self-help book that also has some overtly political undertones in it. But the main thing is it's a self-help book. And in Maps of Meaning and in a lot of his work, he'll talk about the dragon of chaos. And that's why he's making fun of that. That's why it's the dragon who did his homework. And so he points out some examples of Jordan Peterson not really doing the intellectual rigor to understand the historical underpinnings and philosophical underpinnings of what he's talking about. So as an example, the first one I want to talk about is Jordan Peterson consistently uses the term postmodern neo-Marxist. And he uses this to describe people on the modern left of the political spectrum. And Michael does a really good job of pointing out how this doesn't make any sense. Okay. It's effectively a rhetorical word salad. You can't be a postmodernist and a Marxist at the same time, because postmodernism is a branch of philosophy, that seeks to reject totalizing narratives. An example of a totalizing narrative about society would be, Marxism, which is a totalizing narrative in regards to the class struggle within a society, right? So if you don't believe me, there'll be a link in the video, below, that will be a video of the Marxist critique of postmodernism. So you can hear it straight from someone else, talking about it in a much more in detail discussion. But I think that's an important place to start, because these are complicated subjects. And that's why, again, Michael does a good job of conveying them in a way where the layperson can grasp. And I also want to add that Jordan Peterson recycles, on top of this postmodern neo-Marxist stuff, he recycles the phrase cultural Marxists. And he uses this to talk about political opponents, specifically people that focus on, identity politics on the left. And he does this without realizing it, but who knows, without realizing that he's literally just rephrasing an old trope from World War II called cultural Bolshevism, which was essentially a Nazi conspiracy theory that stemmed from the idea of Judeo-Bolshevism, which was the Nazis believed that the Jews wanted to topple Nazi Germany by, getting involved in its, intellectual sphere, its art, its politics, and put Marxist ideas in there to change the culture. And so that's how this all melded together to form what was called cultural Bolshevism, which, it's not far off. And it's the same thing that he argues. I mean, he argues that, in the 1960s, that whenever, Marxists were not, around anymore, supposedly, even though he uses specific examples of Sartre, who was overtly a Marxist post 1960s. Basically, he needs to do a little bit more work if he's going to talk about this. But the bigger and more illicit part is that he's essentially spreading a far-right Nazi conspiracy theory. And whether he is aware of that or not, or the people listening are aware of that, this is a conspiracy theory that is deeply anti-Semitic roots. And it led to the Holocaust, like it just did. That being said, this is not something that is surprising. I mean, when you look at our political climate today, you see this in politics where people will talk about how, there is that professors are indoctrinating people in like liberal identity politics or leftism. And again, this is not anything new. And that's why Michael's focus on using history as to gain a better understanding of what is being said today and the context with which it's being said is really important to prevent charlatans from pulling a fast one on you. The other good example he does uses with JP is Jordan Peterson did a debate with Slavoj Žižek. Slavoj Žižek is a philosopher who describes himself as a Marxist. And so the two of them had a debate a couple years ago called Happiness, Capitalism versus Marxism. And Jordan Peterson was arguing for capitalism and against Marxism. In the debate, he admits to having only read the Communist Manifesto when he was 18. So this means that he only touched about like a 20-page text decades ago and went in thinking that this would be enough research to discuss a complex historical, economic, political, and philosophical topic, right? A lot of interdisciplinary studies here. I wouldn't do this for making a YouTube video, right? Because I know I wouldn't have done my due diligence to talk about such a complex topic. He did this for a over 2-hour debate with someone who is effectively an expert in the field, right? Back to the dragon needs to do his homework. From this minimal effort, he claimed that even Marx admitted capitalism was the most productive economic system in history so far. And he did this as though it was a gotcha, right? As though he had gotten, Žižek and the Marxist by the balls and saying that even Marx is a simp for capitalism, right? But the problem is that, and Michael points this out very eloquently, is that that's the point, Jordan. Like, that's the point. Marxism, or historical materialism as it's also known, it's a critique about how capitalism has, inherent contradictions that will require it to change to a more efficient system, right? Just like when feudalism switched to capitalism. Marxism, is looking at how history changes based on material conditions, right? And the interactions between the classes over those. So it's like, it shows that Jordan Peterson is approaching a materialist-based philosophy from an idealist and moralist perspective, right? Which on a deeper level shows that he lacks the philosophical understanding to even begin this argument, which, really shows what's going on, okay? And that he thought that this was a slam dunk just shows a lack of understanding for the topic and intellectual laziness that just so happens to coincide with a paycheck. I'll let you decide, what your opinions of that are, but seems fishy to me. But my favorite part, while it's cool to clown on him and all this and point out, it is very important to point out arguments and how they are faulty and be able to show that to people, right? It's very important to understand that and to have a good contextualized framework with which to view the world. No question. But my favorite thing from this chapter, and one of my favorite things from the book, is, as Michael always did, right? He talks about how we shouldn't laugh off or ignore, okay, the effects of people like Jordan Peterson and why they're so effective, okay? Because Jordan Peterson's influence is vital to understand. His audience is mostly made up of the same people who buy other self-help books, toxic positivity, hustle culture types, people that are disaffected in our current political, and economic environment, that feel increasingly alienated and have this desire, to have some sort of a parasocial relationship with a father figure to tell them to, clean your room. And that's not abnormal. That is understandable based on the material conditions that we face, especially during COVID, where you have even accelerated alienation because of so many people working from home, not being able to hang out with friends. It's important to understand. And the dramatic irony of this is that Marx even talks about alienation being a result of the commodification of every aspect of our lives. And that this, this is something that's pretty, big in Marxist thought. So maybe, again, like Michael says, Jordan Peterson should start doing his homework, and also the people that are attracted to him should. But the bigger point is that's why we need to reach out to people that are disaffected, that are alienated, and talk to them about what are the material goals that we all share and how are we going to move towards them, instead of allowing those disaffected people to be sucked up into a vacuum by someone who's essentially just cashing a paycheck and reselling the same old self-help ideas that ignore the environmental realities that people face and oftentimes have to deal with, that puts them in those alienated situations to begin with. And then the last chapter of the book is called Beyond the IDW. And so this focuses on Michael's call to action. In this, he talks about the need for viewing politics from an internationalist perspective, right? So looking at things not just from a hyper-nationalistic perspective of, I'm looking at this as I'm an American, or I'm a Californian, or I'm a North Carolinian, looking at things from the perspective of how does this affect me? How does this affect people in Vietnam? How does this affect people in Brazil? What are our shared material goals, and how do we move forward as human beings, not as individual nationalist focused people, right? And that's because we have more in common with the average person in these other countries than we do with, say, Jeff Bezos, from a material standpoint. We're much closer to being a refugee from Syria than we are to being a billionaire. At least I know I am. And actually, even I believe it's even Bill Gates technically is closer to being broke than to Jeff Bezos, which is wild to think about. But that gives you the idea. That's why we need to focus on that. And also, it's kind of important to have a dialectic understanding of what people face in other places, what people face here, and vice versa, because that gives us a better understanding of the world around us, so that we are able to, have knowledge that is consistent, internally. And he also focuses on how we need to keep this grounded in materialism, which means focusing on the reality that we live in a material world, and that is something that everyone shares. And we can use that as a way to talk about economics, politics, and what needs to be done in order for the best results to happen for the most amount of people. And then on top of that, he really, and I really like this because this is something I'm really big on, is he hammers home how nobody is going to win over these disaffected people that flock to these types of ideologues, through telling them to check their privilege. This is not a productive thing, right? Telling a poor person in North Carolina, in rural North Carolina, where I'm from originally, telling them that, oh, well, you think you have it bad, but you have white privilege. Yes, intersectionality is a thing. Yes, it matters. that is not a productive way to move forward. That is a moralistic argument to make you feel better, right? You may feel like, oh, I'm more morally superior because I acknowledge that I have this privilege. And again, privileges exist. I do have that privilege. But what we need to focus on is, what do we all have in common, right? Not dividing and not, sectarian politics. Let's focus on how do we work together to achieve goals that work for everyone else. And that is the problem with, identity politics in the United States, is oftentimes they distract from working class people coming together and recognizing that we have a lot in common and we need to use that as a force to make everyone's lives better. Now, that is not an excuse for people being racist. Of course, racism exists. Of course, sexism exists. Of course, Islamophobia exists, etc. But what we need to remember is that the reason to break those barriers down, and the reason to make sure that we all treat each other as, again, human beings, regardless of who we are, what we look like, where we live, back to that internationalist perspective, we need to focus on what are our material, connections, and how do we make those maximized for everyone. And focusing on moralistic arguments, as Michael argues, only serves to keep people with similar material interests divided and even more alienated. And that is not what we want. That is not something that's going to help working class people. Then what I really, really like is he gives an example to hammer this home on the internationalist side about when the Russians launched Sputnik, and I'll read that. So he's giving an example of a conversation that happened when Sputnik was launched, and that was, the first human-made satellite to orbit the Earth. And the conversation goes, we did it. And then the response is, what? He says, Sputnik. We put something in the sky that didn't come down. And then he says, you mean the Russians did? He says, no, we, us, the human race. And this is powerful stuff. And this is, in my opinion, the way we need to look at things, because we need to remember that no matter what happens, that we're all on this planet together. Whatever our differences are, those differences are subjective. The one thing that we know for sure is that we live on this material world, and that we can use that to make our lives better by working together. And that is what I really, really liked about this. My takeaway for the book overall is that I really loved this book. It's a beautiful and approachable writing style that is entertaining, packed with historical and philosophical concepts, but related in an unintimidating way that someone who hasn't read as much on this is still going to get a ton out of it. And, I share the same goal as Michael. I agree that the focus on how we should talk to each other and how, material goals that we share is what should help us, work together to make society better for all of us. And I'm really thankful to be able to rewatch and reread his work. And I will leave links below to some of those so that you should, check them out. And also a link for the book. The link I'll leave is for Red Emma's. It's a worker-owned co-op. So, while I don't think that ethical consumption really exists under our current economic system, might as well, if you can, make it a little bit better by supporting some workers directly. But overall, I really, really love the work that Michael did. And I miss the fact that he's not around today. Just a beautiful human being. And also, check out Left Reckoning. It's a YouTube channel that is continuing to do the same type of work. It's run by David Griscom and Matt Lech, who both worked with him. And, it's really cool to see how, even though he wasn't here, as long as he should have been, it's cool to see how already his influence is making things better, and pushing people to, work towards a more internationalist and material focused politics. And, we need more people like Michael, and we need more of this type of discourse to build a better world together. And that's why I highly think that if you can, you should check out Against the Web. Again, it's a short book. I read it in an afternoon, and that was with putting all these little notes in it. It is packed full of really good insights And I think it's a really great thing. If you're someone who already is similar politically, then you'll definitely enjoy it. And find some good insights. I think if you know someone who likes members of the IDW that I've talked about here, I think that they would actually probably be open to it, because it's not confrontational. It's very, or judgmental. It's done in a way. The critiques are done in a way that is very focused on addressing their arguments directly, and so I think it's also really good for those types of people. But overall, it's a book, in my opinion, everyone should read. And yeah, go check it out. And in honor of Michael, I have to say, left is best. And thank you, brother, for all the work that you did. You know, really, really I'm glad to have known you even parasocially.